I sent that link out to some of the startups. Dave, you sent out about the, I guess, that one loan program.
Oh yeah. Well, there's a few out there now, but the big one is the CARES Act. Yeah.
Okay, we are streaming live now. Got 3 minutes left. I think what I'm going to do too. This sounds really good. I think I'm gonna keep the headsets on. Sometimes I don't, Dave, but it actually sounds. I can hear you really clearly. That's what I'm gonna do too. Set that part up. And Stephen, maybe we'll at the end you can talk about tech school for next week. I'll prep you on that one, and then I think we're good. We'll wait a couple more minutes, Dave. But before we start, though, you do have to kind of tell me where you get that chair from.
Where I got the chair? Oh, this is a clutch chair. It's a clutch chair. Yeah. Yeah. Anybody who's anybody in gaming knows clutch chairs. Come on.
I'm not that solid.
That's the key. I'm sitting in the chair. I want to be relevant for the younger crowd. So
no, that's good. It's good. It's good. It's good.
I'm proud of the fact that I was, part of the first gaming generation, right? We were the first ones to have personal computers and actually have, grow up playing video games. So I was going to rot our brains, and there was no point in doing it. And who's ever going to have a job playing a video game and all that kind of stuff. So didn't turn out quite the way my parents imagined. So
right. But now we got Twitch and all these other pieces to us.
We have a whole sector of the economy based on gaming and watching people play games. So yeah, it's alive and well.
We got Stephen. We have to incorporate that in one another tech school sessions.
Even you should actually bring somebody on board who is an ex-CEO of a gaming studio.
Okay, I like that one.
Yeah,
I like that one. I know my brother-in-law and Joanna. They work for Rockstar Games.
There you go.
So they could that might be it. Okay, about 1 minute till start time. I'm gonna introduce you right then, but I know I'm gonna pull up your bio, which I like a lot. It's 12. Dave, thanks for coming on Tech School. We're still improving on it. Like with startups, we're always trying to it's kind of MVP, right? Minimal viable product. So we're still learning. Let me just read your bio, because I always feel it's so extensive. And we talked about earlier about like there's certain things that we even miss out on our bio. So I know I'll read this out, but I think it's one key factor. One, you're also a good friend too, and you've been very gracious and generous, even giving feedback to us at Fokcus and also giving feedback to some of the startups. So thanks for always being really solid on that. I know you've been executive entrepreneur. I'll read it off. Dave brings more than 25 years of experience in startups, which we love, turnarounds and Fortune 50 companies. Dave is a co-founder and former CEO of Team Vibe, a SaaS company that helps companies streamline and optimize internal communications. Over the last 7 years, Dave's executive consulting work at Massive Dynamics, always love that name, spans an array of international companies such as Sonata Services, that's in Hong Kong, and South Bend Interactive, Malmo, Sweden, and the interim CEO of Room 5, which is a really good story. We maybe had some Room 5 stories in there. He successfully executive the restructuring and spin out of that company from an international parent company. And it's Tactile. This is a new one, new AB. Room 5 was then acquired by a Danish consultant company, Cyclone AB. Is that right? Did I say it right?
Right, yeah.
I know that story. We have to do part 2. Dave's passion for launching new products and technology with his desire to build high-performance teams has been a winning combination throughout his career. His experience as executive manager, sales, product managing, engineering teams, and finance are foundation of Dave's repeated success. Dave founded Telesis Inc., acquired by Euro RSCG, a habits company, served at Exingo. All these kind of startup names. I love that.
Always startup companies. If it's got a weird name, it's a startup.
Yeah, this is great. Acquired by Motorola Mobility and Google company. Cyray Wireless, acquired by Broadcom, and Prairie Com, acquired by Freescale Semiconductors. Thanks for coming on and talk about leadership tools. And we're trying to expand how we think of tech school, but these type of topics we feel any startup or someone in that tech industry would need. So you have the floor.
You read through that bio, and I feel tired just thinking about all. Every one of those companies was just an enormous amount of work, right? So
it's great. But one other thing I know Stephen always reminds me, we have the chat on Zoom. So if you guys have questions throughout Dave's talk, we're gonna stop periodically to think about some of the questions you asked and see if we can maybe incorporate that in. But just use the chat function in Zoom, and then we'll answer those questions too. And then there you go.
All right, super. So I guess one of the first things I'll ask the group is, when you think of tools that you would use in the disciplines of leadership functions, what tools do you use, right? What tools come to mind as things that you go to? And if you're using tools and you're happy with them, or you're not happy with them, make a note in the comment section. I'd like to touch on those things and see what people are using. But I thought it was an interesting subject that we could talk about today was, what is out there today? How do I go about understanding when I should use a tool? And what does it look like to successfully deploy tools, specifically in the area of supporting leaders within growing companies or existing companies today, right? So, what's best here? Do you want me to just kind of riff down stuff, or you want to ask questions?
What I would say is let's go off that note. I love riffing at the beginning, and then I'll get more formal.
Sure.
Is that good?
Yeah, that sounds good. So, well, let me share a little bit about my own interest in these things, right? So, in my career, I'm an engineer by training. I moved up through the management side and became a founder of a number of companies as well. So I've kind of worn every hat that you have inside most tech companies today at one point or another. And in various leadership roles, whether it was leading technical projects or leading small teams or leading entire companies and having a set like vision and direction, there's always at some point I struggled to try to get the support I wanted or needed to be successful in that role, right? And today, if you look through HRIS tools in general in the SaaS space, there's a myriad of different tools out there. We're of course familiar with a lot of the productivity tools that we use every day, stuff like Slack, stuff like Teams, that really help us kind of get our job done. I'm not talking so much about those tools. Those are kind of on the productivity side. I'm thinking about tools that support what it looks like to run a team, to build an organization, to develop a community, and all the facets that go into successfully doing that, right? And that would include things like employee recognition or employee reviews as well. And so you may or may not be somebody who's using those tools today, or you may feel like, oh, that's a good idea. Maybe I should use those tools, right? What are they, and how do I get involved using them, and how do I use them successfully? Right, does it make sense?
That makes sense. Yeah, I like that. I remember I was talking about even in this leadership kind of umbrella, there's all these different avenues, right? And that was fascinating to me. So
yeah. So maybe let me tell a little story about Room 5 that actually leads me into kind of the genesis of Team Vibe as well as a product. So those
nice.
two come together nicely. So this is back in 2010. I took over the CEO role of Room 5, which was a software consulting firm based out of Sweden with a US headquarters as well on the West Coast here in San Diego. And when I took over the company, the previous founder had left, the CEO had left, and I was assigned by the board to step in initially in an interim role. Ended up being almost a 5-year position for me before we sold the company. But the biggest challenge I had, well, there were 3 challenges. One is the business was running negative profits. The previous founder and CEO had created a really terrible, toxic environment. And there was no cash reserves.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Who wouldn't want this job, right? So it was during that time at Room 5 where I had to focus intently the first probably 18 months. I'll ignore the business development, the sales, and
sure, yeah,
and the revenue side of that. I want to talk about the team building piece of it, because the culture of the company was really broken. And I had to go into a really aggressive communication mode and over communicate to the staff about what we were doing, why we were doing it, how we were going to do it, what was important to us. And what I found at that point in time was there were no good tools to help me do that job.
Yeah.
I mean, email is oddly enough, a relatively horrible communication tool when you're trying to connect with employees, both in your office and in other remote offices as well. It's really, I mean, it's very, very basic, and it's not a good engagement platform. And so, at the time, I ended up using a lot of video. Quite frankly, I did a lot of pre-recorded video messages that went out at lunchtime, and we tried to make them both humorous and interesting. The goal was to put a face on leadership and put a really consistent and clear message with a lot of information and a lot of transparency, which is what the company needed at that point in time. And that worked very well. I mean, we were very successful at building a great culture there. And we moved forward with a lot of success and built a really, really strong team. But I still felt like I was cobbling that together, right? There weren't great engagement tools, really didn't exist back then so much. Today, there are a number of tools that you could probably use for that kind of work. TeamVibe is one of them. So TeamVibe is a company I founded after I left Room 5. But we said, hey, we want something. We want a tool that we can use, a platform we can use to engage people directly on a range of subjects, either subjects that they have, or questions that they have, or subjects that, as management team, you want to make sure people understand clearly, right? And so, I mentioned before, email is a terrible way of doing that in general. And quite frankly, tools like Slack and Workplace and Teams aren't necessarily the best tools either, because that's a lot of there's a feed nature to the social element there. Like if you catch the comment when it comes through, you saw it. If you didn't, then you're scrolling back and you're probably never going to read it, right? And even though it's a one-on-many or a one-on-one kind of tool, there's no real permanence. So, for example, I'll give you one example. If I, as a CEO, wanted to have a conversation with my team about one of the core principles in the business, which was that we're a learning organization, and I said, okay, we're a learning organization. We're committed to ongoing learning. We're committed to being a team that's always looking to learn more and to develop as individuals. That's not a terrible email necessarily. It's a relatively bad Slack message. But then if I say, okay, let's all talk about and demonstrate the fact that we're an organization that does that, right? That's kind of an ongoing, evergreen conversation that should happen. And there's not really a very good tool for that today. So that's one of the reasons we developed Team 5 years ago, was that we could have a dedicated area where those conversations could happen. They had some permanence. They're very discoverable. They're very searchable. And anyone from, kind of from a grassroots perspective can create conversations and chime in and have a dialogue around different subjects that are really important to the company, right? So that's just one example, right? as a community engagement tool that we had built years ago. So I'm going to pause there and see if Curly, if you get questions or.
I have some questions from some other startups offhand. I might save those for later, Dave, offhand.
Fine.
I do know offhand what we're always trying to strive for with tech school is like if you're a startup, if you're just starting out, what are some next steps? What are some initial things that people can actually do? Right?
Yeah,
Maybe.
So one of the challenges when you've got a lot of tools and solutions out there is which one's right for me and how do I decide, right? So I think whatever your issue is, whether it's, I mean, it could be employee reviews is a big issue. As you scale as a company, it gets more and more complex to manage your team and make sure people are on their career path and whatnot. There's a lot of good tools out there today that you can use to do reviews, manage reviews, 360 reviews, all that kind of thing. The first thing though you have to understand before you make a tool selection or even begin to get demos and look at things is what's my own culture, what's my own methodology on these things. So for example, if you're an organization that uses Myers-Briggs or you use DISC for assessments or you use Radford for leveling employees, pay and career path and things, those are all legitimate, right? First, you have to understand what your methodology is. Then you have to find the tool that supports that, because not every tool will support every kind of methodology. And then you end up spending a lot of time trying to force a tool to do something that it quite frankly doesn't do. And there's enough out there today that chances are you'll find the tool that supports you best in that area. So first methodology or process, and then find a tool that does that, and then deploy that, right? Otherwise, what you end up with, unfortunately, is a tool that gets deployed with the right intent, but never gets used or never works right.
That makes sense. You use one word, a culture. And I think even for a startup or even if you're going into a big company, can you define what you mean by culture? Maybe we can step back.
Every company has a culture. Every company has a culture, whether you define it or not. Every company has a culture, and it could be a bad one, right? Or at least by some definitions, it could be a bad one. Every company has a culture, and it's really up to the leadership to define what you want that place of work to be. So the culture is the culture is, I guess I would define it as the spirit that exists in and around the people that work in an organization. That binds them together and moves them forward, right? That's and that could be a bad culture, right? You could have a bad culture that defines who you are and who you work for, and what your relationship is with the people you work with. That could also define a bad culture. There's plenty of bad cultures out there. There's politically toxic environments. You don't have to look very far anywhere, and you find those, right? Yeah. And they absolutely define the work environment, right? So good companies understand that culture exists and it's their choice how they want to shape it, and they can they can take appropriate steps to make a good culture, right?
There was one thing that you when we talked about the D4, you said like you even told the audience like, what tools are you using now to kind of facilitate leadership, right? And what do you mostly hear from people when you ask that?
When you define leadership, you said, or?
Oh no, when we were talking about before, you said like, what kind of tools are you using today to facilitate leadership?
Yeah.
When you talk to people like that, what most of the time what you hear when you ask that question?
Right. So it depends. It depends what you're leading. If you're leading people, that's one set of disciplines, right? And that's one set of tools. If you're leading solutions or technical issues, for example, that's a different set. If your leadership responsibilities involve productivity specifically, then you're looking at productivity tools, right? So if I'm a PM on the F-22 project and my project length is 32 years, right, I'm going to use one set of tools for that. They're going to be kind of rooted in project management type things. But if I'm leading a team And I need to focus on things I mentioned before, like, do people understand their roles and responsibilities? Am I reviewing them fairly against those things? Do people in my organization feel like they have a career path and they know where that leads? That's a different set of tools. Does that make sense?
Makes sense. I like how you put them in like categories, right?
Yeah.
If you're leading people, certain things, leading product.
Depending what you're doing and what you're leading, you're going to have different kinds of challenges and different kinds of problems, right? Now, that being said, tools don't, they can't take an untrained leader or an unexperienced leader and make you great. That just takes a lot of time and mentorship, hopefully. And if you went through the school of hard knocks like a lot of us did, you just learn through error as well. But tools can definitely support the best things that we do, right? There's a question in the chat, I think, from Samuel about tools on org and culture change. Some go-to. Well, I mean, I mentioned Team Vibe already. So Team Vibe is a tool that we definitely has a strong impact on culture because we open communications. We had a philosophy when we built the tool originally that every employee wanted to have a voice, and Team Vibe allows everyone in the organization to have a voice on subjects, which is fantastic. And if you're going to be if that's part of the culture that you want, if transparency is important, then you need to open up to tools like a Team Vibe, where people can have direct communication with anyone in the organization, and they can have very open communication as well, right? As far as cultural tools go, it depends a lot on what it is that you're trying to, what area of the culture you're trying to develop, right? In my example at Room 5, there was a severe lack of trust in senior management, and so the way we addressed it was we did that's what I was just mentioning, which was we opened up a very, very transparent communication line between the entire senior management team and everyone else in the company. And that it addressed the problem because it kind of, there was no shadow to hide under. Everything was very on the table. We did what we said, and we meant what we said, and it was obvious in everyone's actions, and you follow through on those things. And so, those kinds of moves were significant because of those particular cultural issues. Now, it's going to depend on what the problems or the things you're trying to change in the culture are, as far as what tools you're going to roll out, right? Does that make sense?
That makes sense, and that's Professor Clark. He's always been working with a lot of startups, and he's seen the gamut. So I think that's a good question. He even had a follow-up question about, now that more people are working from home, how do some of these tools work?
Yeah,
probably work at this kind of distance.
Well, they work as well, if not better, I suppose. We're learning, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of funny to see. I mean, this is a relevant subject, I suppose, too. Is that we've for a long time now had people who telecommute, and it's been growing acceptance in the last 10 years because of tools, right? Because you can either get someone on a cell phone, or you can jump on a video call, or you can share and collaborate on a slide deck in real time. Those tools exist as enabled the telecommuting life to work, right? And to really not be much of a distraction, so much so that there's a lot of mid-sized companies today who are completely virtualized. They have no brick and mortar. And that, I think, is going to be on the rise because those tools are only going to get better, right? And so to some extent, I think what we're seeing right now with the lockdown is that organizations that fought some of these collaboration and productivity tools and some of these virtual tools have been forced to accept them because they don't have a choice. And they're finding out, hey, these things actually work pretty well.
Exactly.
So I think as a result, I think when we come out on the other side of this, I think there's a lot more organizations that'll be more open-minded about some of this because they've lived through it, which is great, right?
I have, most of our questions from the startups is always like, what's a tangible example? Like, so one would be, even with the Room 5 example, what was one tangible tactical move that you guys did? I'll give you an example. Like, I just read this book called Principles by Ray Dalio. And one way they did this radical transparency is that they made sure they recorded every meeting, right? And everyone had access to every meeting
Yep.
to listen. Like that was one way, like radical transparency. Was there something of that nature? Was there one tangible example you guys did to add that transparency? Or bring five?
I think the example I gave was good one. I can go into a little more detail about it, but what I did is I ended up recording a monthly video called Coffee with the CEO. And the idea was almost like this kind of setting. It was basically me and a cup of coffee, and I basically talked about everything in the business. I went down sales, business development,
Nice.
Staffing, facilities issues, because we were doing a lot of build out in offices, company profitability, company cash. I showed financials directly. Everyone saw the P&L every month, exactly what we were making, what profits we had or didn't have. And so I just shoved it all on the table, and I did it with a little bit of humor. And I never missed sending it out. And I would also track all the videos and analytics we had used. And I wish for the life of me I remember what it was, but we used a video distribution tool where it was all private. It's all locked down. So we knew it wouldn't be going outside the company because we shared a lot of confidential information. Sure. But I was able to track all the analytics. And so we could see, because I'd send it out at lunchtime, and we could see that like 98% of the views on the video happened in the first 12 minutes after it went out.
Got it. Nice.
Right. We did it on Fridays. And what we were seeing there is that the engagement on the employee side was extremely high, right? People were consuming it. They were looking at, we could even tell how much the video they watched, right?
Nice.
When people broke away and things like that. So that was very, very useful for us to understand, like, was that a successful way of doing it or not?
Sure.
I'm a huge fan of, try something and then measure it, right? And if not, make adjustments if it doesn't work.
No, I like that. And that helps with large companies and big companies. We're at that 24-minute mark. I think we're doing really good. We have one more question. It's a technical question. I probably could had this is Steve. Steven has been doing a lot. Steven, you can unmute yourself and you can answer it if you want. I mean, you can ask the question.
Okay, sure. Oh, just the one that I.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So, just had a question for you. We've dealt with a lot of startups and entrepreneurs who may come from various backgrounds, right? And some of those, especially early on in their careers, might not be leadership. So I know you spoke about starting in, your career as more of a technical role, engineering role, and then moving on to these leadership roles later on in your career. The first question was, what hurdles did you find in making that transition, and how did you overcome those hurdles? And then two, what are some of those leadership tools you may have used throughout that transition, and why were they effective or not effective?
Really good question. Actually, that could be the subject of a whole That's
a good one, though. I like
I think to answer the first question, my largest hurdles when moving into, like, especially senior leadership roles, was me. Was tackling, I think, my own personal biggest challenges and recognizing what I was good at, what I needed to work on, where I needed to improve and develop as a leader, right? There was, it's a whole, just like, is when you're an engineer, you spend all this time learning and training and doing those disciplines, right? Recognizing that there are pure disciplines inside leadership that you have to develop like you do technical disciplines. And I mentioned communication multiple times. That's a huge one. I can't underemphasize communication. There's two, and Curling, you know this from our other group, but there's the top two characteristics of the most successful leaders, and the bottom two characteristics of the least successful leaders are the same thing, which is flexibility and people skills, right? It doesn't sound like rocket science, but it's really true. And I think for me, when I was making the transition, I had to understand what it looked like to lead, not by consensus in the sense like, hey, let's all do it because, we're all chipping in, but leading by setting a really clear vision leading by setting a vision that was exciting, and making sure that I could follow through in the things that we did. And when you ask an organization or a small team, whatever it is, to step out and try something and do something, you have to find tangible success. If you don't, you have failed as a leader, right? And that doesn't matter if you're a startup company and you're a CEO just cutting your teeth on something, or if you've got a team of 3 people and you're doing your first scrum, right? You have to find measurable, successful, tangible things that you can do and say, hey, we did that right. Good job, everyone. Let's go to the next thing, right? So that you're operating as a team and you're all winning together. So that's the first part of the question. That's one example. I think as far as tools were concerned, I think that's changed a lot over time. And once again, depending on the challenges that we were facing as well. I think I've always been an early adopter of different kinds of tools. Like I love some of the small survey tools that you can deploy today, that you can flinch quick responses from team members on. There's a number of them that are out there. They're all pretty interesting. It, once again, depends a little bit on the culture and the demographic of your company. I think those can be used with great success. I would also say that that performance management tools are good if they don't have a lot of overhead. So my personal style on those kinds of tools is they need to be relatively clean. So if I'm asking my employees to spend an hour a week writing up status information, or logging whether or not they're being successful, they're not going to do that. But if I can give them something that takes 5 minutes, then I got a pretty good chance in getting regular reporting back, right? It's kind of like when you've got a sales team and people are like, hey, what CRM should I use? I've got a sales team, right? There's a million CRMs, what should I use? And my answer is always the same one, which is use the CRM that your salespeople will actually enter data into.
Yes, yeah.
Because the only important thing in a CRM is the data that's in it, right? So if you deploy the most wonderfully rated CRM out there, but your salespeople never take time to enter data, it's the worst CRM for your company, right? So find the tool that's right for the team that you're using.
Yeah, I like that, Dave. We even say that in technology, right? If you have a technical team and to use that, yeah, use the one that your teams are using GitHub. Use GitHub, right?
And the opposite is true too. We've our team I've experienced, we talked to a lot of companies, not even large companies, mid-sized companies, who told us that they're like, we had to disable Slack. We had to tell people they couldn't use Slack anymore. Because literally their team was sitting at their desks, typing away, chatting on Slack, but not about work, right? And it was like, and this HR director was like out of her mind. She's like, I can't get my people to code. She's like, we're getting like an hour of productivity. It's a total nightmare, right? Now that was a cultural issue for them, right? And sure. I would have argued with her that Slack wasn't the problem. You have other issues why people aren't actually working on their work, right? Sure, Slack was just the that was just the distraction in that case, right? But yeah, tools can create challenges too, right?
That's good. I told Professor Clark, Sam Clark, like if he wants to add anything, he's been heading Innovation Hub at Cal State San Marcos. Dave, so right near you. Sam, you want to add anything?
Well, I think I'll just add a little bit about that. I think that transition from kind of that engineer role to the leadership role, I always see it as a transition from where you're working in conditions of certainty, where you're given tasks and roles and assignments to complete, to moving into a role where you're working in conditions of uncertainty. And I think that's one of the big difficult transitions that you have to make, is that you're no longer told what to do, how to do it, when to do it. Your goal is to set the vision, and then and it becomes a much more uncertain environment. And so when you get to that point, I think that the tools that work best, and I don't know exactly what tools, and maybe David has some ideas, is that one of the challenges that you'll face is that you then, and I think this is what David was trying to do with Room 5, is that you're in that uncertain environment. Now you have to communicate certainty down to your employees.
Yep.
So you take what's uncertain, and that's the world you live in. And now you have to make that very clear and certain for everybody else, because employees work in certainty. If there's uncertainty in their jobs, there's chaos. I think that's where we have those cultural breakdowns and the problems, is because they don't know what to do or how to do it or when to do it. But that's the world you live in as a leadership role. Yeah. And you have to make sure that employees don't.
Samuel, totally agree. Very well said. And I will also add in there too, that employees want certainty, and they don't thrive well on uncertainty, right? They're very uncomfortable. Most people are especially engineers, extremely uncomfortable with uncertainty. But it's not just the employees. You also have to bring certainty to the board. I've never had worse bosses than when I was the CEO. And everyone's like, oh, the CEO, he runs the show, he does whatever he wants, right? It's like, reporting to a board is horrible in general, right? Some people are lucky enough to have good boards, but I've never had worse bosses than I've had board members. And if there's a good tool to help manage boards, I want to know what it is, because I don't have it today.
That's interesting. There's some opportunity there. We have startups online.
But that's good you mentioned that, Dave, because I wrote down when we were talking, I made a note and I said, startup founders board relationship tools, because that's where I see that same challenge.
It's so difficult, and there is so much uncertainty, especially, and the board really wants detail, right? They really want, they don't want to know what happens next week. They want to know what happens in 5 years, right? Good luck, right? Painting that picture clearly so that they'll write another check, right? Or whatever that is. That's a big challenge.
That's huge. Wow, I love how we actually went from the gamut to all the way back to startups and boards. I love that.
Put a note down. Curly. We should do a chats, not me necessarily, but you should do a chat sometime on managing boards.
Okay, I like that. That's a good tech school.
I wish someone had taught me about that before I started working in startups.
That's a great one. It's a little board primer, we can call it.
Yeah, really.
Well, Dave, thanks for coming on. I always allow you to do, like, you want to have one closing thought. You have the startups here. We have other groups that are listening.
If I just wrap back to the tools discussion really quickly, I would just say, remember the purpose of tools is to reduce overhead, right? So focus on first your own processes and methodologies when it comes to tools, and then find the right tool, and then deploy that. And if you're not reducing overhead, then you pick the wrong tool. It's
great. I love that. That's really clear, concise. Definitely appreciate that at Tech School. I know I have Stephen. You're still on. You want to talk about next week's episode?
Sure. Yeah. So next week, for those of you that are listening in, just kind of a quick reminder before I talk about Tech School. I know we said this last week, but for those of you that just use the Zoom link instead of the Eventbrite link, the event link, if you want to be notified of the next version of Tech School, go and register on that Eventbrite link, just so then we'll have your info, and then we can send out that email if you want to be part of that email group. And then as far as next week, we're going to dive a little bit more into momentum in a couple different, talk about it in a couple different ways. We're going to use a couple examples, as far as momentum and growth in startups. And, for those of you who are, starting a company and wondering how that kind of transition takes place. And so we'll talk about that. We'll talk about, the compounding of habits and actions over time for you individually, maybe in your life, and then also for your business. And then we'll try to do some use cases within that too. And I think Sam's going to speak a little bit on this topic as well. So
that's great. Thanks, Stephen, for coordinating everything for Tech School. Thank you again, Dave. Always fun. That was good. Thanks for riffing at the beginning. I was like, all right. Take care, everybody.
All right. Take care.
Yeah.